History has seen empires conquered with armies, but only a few mastered the art of conquering minds. When we think of ancient cruelty, we look to Rome, the gladiator arenas, the crucifixions, the public slave auctions. Rome was brutal, undeniably. But if we turn our eyes east to the mighty Achaemenid Persian Empire, we find something equally terrifying, perhaps even more so. The Persians didn't rely solely on chains and whips. They perfected another weapon: psychological warfare. They broke their enemies from the inside out, and their victims were often not the soldiers or the kings, but their wives, their daughters, their entire families. This is where the story turns dark. Very dark. Souls. When conquest was no longer about territory, but about souls. Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, they were not merely kings. They called themselves King of Kings. Their authority had to be absolute, unquestionable, and eternal. This meant punishing enemies in ways that did more than defeat them on the battlefield. No, the true punishment came after the war, when the dust had settled. It was in this quiet moment after victory that Persia delivered its most devastating blows, erasing the legacy, pride, and dignity of their foes. Let's break it down. The ultimate humiliation, the royal harem. Imagine, you are a queen, a princess, the wife of a king. You have lived in opulent palaces, draped in silks, surrounded by power. Then suddenly your kingdom falls, your husband is dragged away in chains, and you are not sold like a Roman slave but taken into the harem of the Persian king. It sounds luxurious, doesn't it? Gold, servants, exquisite food. But do not be fooled. The harem was not a paradise. It was a gilded prison. You could never leave. You were constantly watched. You existed as a living trophy, a reminder to all that the King of Kings had defeated your family and now owned everything you once represented. The symbolism was brutal. By taking the wives and daughters of defeated rulers, the Persian king declared, "Your dynasty is mine, your future is mine, even your bloodline now belongs to me." And sometimes, these women were not just trophies. They were pawns. Their children, half Persian, half royal, could be used as puppet rulers in their conquered homelands. It was the perfect way to erase one dynasty and replace it with another. Case study: the fall of Babylon, 539 BC. When Cyrus the Great captured Babylon, the last king, Nabonidus, was imprisoned. While sources vary, it is believed his royal family, including his wife and daughters, were absorbed into Cyrus's court. The message was loud and clear, 311. Babylon's royal line was ended. Its women now lived under Persia's shadow. If the harem was the cage, mutilation was the knife. The Persians knew that nothing crushed the spirit of a rival family more than disfiguring its women. Beauty, status, identity, destroyed in a single act. And history gives us one of the most horrifying stories ever told: the tale of Queen Amestris. Herodotus, the Greek historian, tells us of Xerxes I, the emperor who fought the Spartans at Thermopylae. Xerxes had a wandering eye. He became obsessed with the wife of his own brother, Macystes. When he could not seduce her, he married his son to her daughter, Artente. But when Xerxes' own wife, Queen Amestris, discovered his desire, she was enraged. What happened next is chilling. Amestris demanded Macystes' wife be handed over to her. Then, in a calculated act of cruelty, she had the woman's nose, ears, lips, and breasts cut off. She sent the mutilated woman back to her husband. Her body disfigured beyond recognition. This was not merely personal revenge. It was symbolic annihilation. A mistress had erased the woman's identity, her beauty, her very humanity. Macystes, in his fury, rebelled, but Xerxes crushed him and slaughtered his entire family. One act of mutilation led to the erasure of an entire bloodline. When the Persians made an example, they did not do it quietly. They did it where the whole empire could see: rebels, rival kings, traitors. They were often impaled or crucified, and it did not stop there. Their wives and children were sometimes executed alongside them. Corpses were left to rot on stakes outside city gates. Roads were lined with impaled bodies as warnings. This was collective punishment on a terrifying scale. The Behistun inscription, carved into a mountainside in Iran by Darius the Great. This massive monument doesn't just list his victories. It shows defeated kings bound and humiliated, some impaled, others awaiting execution. It wasn't just history, it was propaganda carved in stone. Anyone who saw it knew what awaited those who dared to resist. Music slows, becoming thoughtful and profound. Why was this so devastating? The Romans turned people into property. The Persians aimed for something deeper. Their cruelty was about erasing identity, beauty, and bloodline, destroying beauty. By mutilating queens, they robbed societies of their most symbolic figures. A queen was not just a woman. She was the embodiment of grace, fertility, and dynasty. Destroy her, and you destroyed hope. Ending dynasties. By placing defeated women in the harem, they ended native royal lines and replaced them with their own. Spreading fear. By punishing entire families, not just rulers, they made rebellion a generational death sentence. Who would rise up if it meant their children would suffer too? This was cruelty with a purpose, to make subjects obey out of sheer terror. If Rome was the empire of chains, then Persia was the empire of shadows. Rome's slaves were sold in markets. Persia's queens were imprisoned in harems. Rome's victims were humiliated in arenas. 648 Persians were mutilated in palaces. Rome crucified rebels. Persia impaled entire families. Different methods. Same result. Absolute control. It's easy to see these stories as distant, almost mythical, but pause for a moment. Imagine the silence inside those palaces. Imagine a young princess who once dreamed of ruling her homeland, now locked in a Persian harem, never to see daylight again. Imagine a husband forced to watch his mutilated wife stagger back towards him. That is not just history. That is human tragedy in its rawest, most painful form. The Persians may have built roads, palaces, and a vast empire that inspired awe. But beneath the marble and gold was a system of fear. One that crushed not just armies, but entire bloodlines. When we look back at ancient empires, it's tempting to admire their power and glory. But history also demands honesty. The Persians, like the Romans, used cruelty as a tool. But their weapon was not always whips and chains. It was psychological annihilation. By seizing wives, mutilating queens, and impaling families, they didn't just conquer people. They erased legacies, and perhaps that is the most terrifying part of all. Not the sword on the battlefield, and perhaps that is the most terrifying part of all. Not the sword on the battlefield, but the silent cruelty in the palace after the war was over, because long after the blood had dried, the fear remained. And that is why, even today, the Persian way of breaking enemies leaves us utterly speechless.